The mountains of western North Carolina rise like ancient sentinels from the earth, their peaks softened by millennia of wind and rain, their slopes cloaked in forests so dense that early European settlers called them impenetrable. In the late autumn of 1888, a young man of extraordinary wealth stood at the edge of these mountains, gazing out across a vast expanse of land that would become the canvas for the most audacious private construction project in American history. His name was George Washington Vanderbilt II, and he was 26 years old, heir to a fortune so immense that it defied the comprehension of ordinary Americans. What he envisioned in that moment was not merely a house, not simply a retreat from the pressures of New York society, but a monument to an entire philosophy of life, a crystallization of European aristocratic ideals transplanted onto American soil with a scale and ambition that would dwarf anything that had come before it. The story of Biltmore Estate is not just the story of America's largest private home, a structure containing 250 rooms spread across 178,000 square feet of opulent living space. It is the story of the Gilded Age itself, that extraordinary period of American history when the industrial capitalism created fortunes of unprecedented magnitude, when the gap between rich and poor yawned into a chasm so wide that the wealthy seemed to inhabit a different world entirely, and when men like the Vanderbilts wielded power that rivaled that of European royalty, while the nation around them struggled with questions of labour, immigration, and the very soul of the American experiment. To understand Biltmore, one must first understand the Vanderbilt family and the origins of their almost incomprehensible wealth. The dynasty began not with genteel merchants or educated professionals, but with a man of rough manners and ruthless business instincts named Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was born in 1794 on Staten Island to a family of modest means. Young Cornelius, who would later be known as the Commodore, began his working life ferrying passengers and cargo across New York Harbor in a small sailing vessel, and from these humble beginnings he constructed an empire that would reshape American commerce. The Commodore possessed a genius for identifying economic opportunities and the willingness to pursue them with single-minded ferocity, often crushing competitors through price wars, strategic manipulation of shipping routes, and political maneuvering that operated in the murky spaces where business and corruption met. By the time of the Civil War, Cornelius Vanderbilt had transitioned from shipping to railroads, recognizing that the future of American commerce lay in the steel rails spreading across the continent like the threads of an enormous spider's web. He consolidated numerous small railroad lines into vast networks, most notably the New York Central Railroad, which connected New York City to the Great Lakes and became one of the most profitable enterprises in American history. When the Commodore died in 1877, he left behind a fortune estimated at over $100 million, an almost unimaginable sum that made him the richest man in America and one of the wealthiest individuals in the world. The Commodore's son, William Henry Vanderbilt, inherited the bulk of this fortune and proved himself equally adept at multiplying wealth through shrewd investments and ruthless business practices. William Henry was a more reserved man than his father, but no less driven, and under his stewardship the Vanderbilt fortune nearly doubled in less than a decade. He famously declared, when questioned about the public service obligations of his railroads, "The public be damned," a phrase that captured the attitude of many Gilded Age industrialists toward the common people whose labour created their wealth, but who seemed to exist in their minds as mere abstractions, necessary components of the economic machinery, but unworthy of serious moral consideration. William Henry died in 1885, just 8 years after his father, and his will divided the fortune among his 8 children, creating multiple branches of the Vanderbilt family, each possessed of wealth sufficient to live in almost unimaginable luxury for generations. George Washington Vanderbilt II was William Henry's youngest son, born in 1862, and from his earliest days he was raised in an environment of privilege that few humans in history have experienced. While his older brothers were groomed to continue the family's business empire, George, as the youngest, was given more freedom to pursue intellectual and cultural interests, and he developed into a scholarly young man with a deep love of art, literature, architecture, and horticulture that set him apart from the more commercially minded members of his family. The Gilded Age, the era that formed the context for George Vanderbilt's life and ambitions, was a period of almost dizzying contrasts and contradictions in American society. The term itself, popularized by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner, in their 1873 novel of the same name, captured the essential character of the time. A thin layer of gold covering a base metal underneath, surface brilliance concealing deeper problems and moral corruption. In the decades following the Civil War, American industry expanded at a rate unprecedented in human history, transforming the nation from a primarily agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse that would soon rival and then surpass the manufacturing capabilities of Great Britain and Germany. Railroads expanded from 45,000 miles of track in 1870 to nearly 200,000 miles by 1900, knitting the vast continental expanse into a single economic unit. Steel production, pioneered by men like Andrew Carnegie, multiplied exponentially, providing the raw material for the construction of modern cities, with their soaring skyscrapers and sprawling factory complexes. Oil, refined and distributed by John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company, powered the lamps and machines of this new industrial civilization. The fortunes created by these industries concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of families, creating an American aristocracy of wealth that had no legal titles, but possessed power and privilege exceeding that of European nobility. Yet beneath this gilded surface lay poverty, exploitation, and social tensions that threatened to tear the nation apart. The same industrial system that created vast fortunes for the Vanderbilts, Carnegies, and Rockefellers depended on the labour of millions of workers, many of them immigrants from Europe and Asia, who toiled in conditions of extraordinary hardship for wages that barely sustained life. Factory workers laboured 12 or 14 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week, in environments filled with dangerous machinery, toxic chemicals, and air so polluted that respiratory diseases were endemic. Child labour was common, with children as young as 6 or 7 working in textile mills, coal mines, and canneries, their small bodies particularly vulnerable to industrial accidents and diseases. Housing for industrial workers consisted largely of crowded tenements, where entire families lived in 1 or 2 rooms without adequate sanitation, leading to regular outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis. Labour unions attempted to organise workers and demand better conditions, but they faced violent opposition from employers who hired private armies of guards and strikebreakers, and who could often count on local police and even federal troops to suppress labour actions. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the Haymarket Affair of 1886, the Homestead Strike of 1892, and the Pullman Strike of 1894 were just the most dramatic examples of the violent conflicts between labour and capital that characterised the era. Meanwhile, farmers in the South and West, crushed by debt and exploited by railroad monopolies and eastern banks, organised movements like the Farmers' Alliance and the Populist Party, demanding government regulation of railroads, an expanded money supply, and greater democratic participation in economic decision-making. It was into this world of extreme inequality and social tension that George Vanderbilt introduced his vision of Biltmore. George had spent much of his early adulthood travelling in Europe, particularly in France, where he developed a deep appreciation for the château of the Loire Valley and the grand estates of the French aristocracy. He was particularly drawn to the French Renaissance style, with its combination of Gothic verticality, classical symmetry, and ornate decoration, and he dreamed of creating something similar in America, a private domain that would serve not only as a residence, but as a centre of culture, learning, and agricultural innovation. George was not simply interested in displaying wealth, though Biltmore would certainly accomplish that, but in creating a kind of ideal world, a place where art, nature, and civilized living could exist in perfect harmony, insulated from the industrial chaos and social conflict of the broader society. This vision was in many ways profoundly conservative, even reactionary, representing a retreat into an imagined past of aristocratic grace and feudal order, yet it also contained elements of progressive thinking, particularly in George's interest in scientific forestry, agricultural reform, and the creation of a model estate that might demonstrate better ways of managing land and resources. George's search for the perfect location for his estate led him to Asheville, North Carolina, a small mountain town that had recently become popular among wealthy northerners seeking relief from summer heat and urban congestion. The climate of the southern Appalachians was temperate and healthy, the scenery spectacular, and land was relatively inexpensive compared to the developed areas of the northeast. George began purchasing land in 1888, initially acquiring a few thousand acres, But as his vision expanded, so did his land acquisitions, until he eventually controlled approximately 125,000 acres of mountain forests, valleys and streams, an area roughly equivalent in size to the entire city of Chicago. Much of this land was cut over forest, denuded by decades of destructive logging practices that had left behind eroded slopes and depleted soils, and George was determined to restore it through scientific management, making Biltmore not just a private estate, but a demonstration of conservation principles that were just beginning to gain traction in American public discourse. To design his house, George turned to Richard Morris Hunt, the most prominent architect in America and himself a product of French training at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Hunt had already designed several Vanderbilt family homes, including the massive Fifth Avenue mansions of George's brothers, and he understood instinctively what George wanted: a French château transplanted to American soil, but on a scale that would surpass anything in France itself. The design Hunt created for Biltmore was breathtaking in its ambition and complexity. The house would be built in the style of a French Renaissance château, with steeply pitched roofs, ornate stone carvings, and a limestone façade that would glow golden in the southern sunlight. The floor plan included 250 rooms, including 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces, along with an indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, a gymnasium, and a basement that housed mechanical systems so advanced they seemed to belong to the future rather than the past. The grand staircase, rising through 3 stories of the house, would be illuminated by enormous stained glass windows. The banquet hall, measuring 72 feet in length with a barrel-vaulted ceiling, rising 70 feet above the floor, would be large enough to host hundreds of guests and would feature a massive triple fireplace and a pipe organ. The library would house George's collection of over 23,000 volumes, making it one of the finest private libraries in America. Every detail would be executed with the finest materials and the most skilled craftsmanship that money could command: marble imported from Italy, oak panelling from England, decorative elements carved by European master craftsmen, tapestries and furniture acquired from European estates and auction houses. To design the grounds and gardens, George hired Frederick Law Olmsted, the nation's most celebrated landscape architect, who had already created Central Park in New York and numerous other public spaces that demonstrated how carefully planned landscapes could provide both aesthetic beauty and social benefits. Construction of Biltmore began in 1889 and would continue for 6 years, employing at its peak over 1,000 workers, including skilled stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, and metal workers, many of them brought from Europe specifically for this project. The scale of the undertaking staggered the imagination. A private railroad spur had to be constructed to transport materials to the building site, including millions of bricks manufactured in kilns built specifically for the project, thousands of tons of Indiana limestone for the façade, and countless wagon loads of marble, tile, and other finished materials. An entire village was built to house workers and provide workshops, stables, and storage facilities. The basement of the house contained mechanical systems that were marvels of late 19th century engineering: an electrical plant to generate power for the hundreds of light fixtures, an elaborate refrigeration system using ammonia compressors to preserve food, a complex network of hot water radiators for heating, and even electric elevators, a technology so new that few people had experienced it. The coordination required to orchestrate this vast enterprise, to ensure that materials arrived in the proper sequence, that skilled craftsmen were available when needed, that the countless architectural details were executed correctly, represented a management challenge comparable to building a small city, and George Vanderbilt oversaw it all with meticulous attention, reviewing architectural drawings, approving material selections, and monitoring construction progress through regular site visits. Construction of Biltmore began in 1889 and would continue for 6 years, employing at its peak over 1,000 workers, including skilled stonemasons, carpenters, plasterers, and metal workers, many of them brought from Europe specifically for this project. The scale of the undertaking staggered the imagination. A private railroad spur had to be constructed to transport materials to the building site, including millions of bricks manufactured in kilns built specifically for the project, thousands of tons of Indiana limestone for the façade, and countless wagon loads of marble, tile, and other finished materials. An entire village was built to house workers and provide workshops, stables, and storage facilities. The basement of the house contained mechanical systems that were marvels of late 19th century engineering. An electrical plant to generate power for the hundreds of light fixtures, an elaborate refrigeration system using ammonia compressors to preserve food, a complex network of hot water radiators for heating, and even electric elevators, a technology so new that few people had experienced it. The coordination required to orchestrate this vast enterprise, to ensure that materials arrived in the proper sequence, that skilled craftsmen were available when needed, that the countless architectural details were executed correctly, represented a management challenge comparable to building a small city, and George Vanderbilt oversaw it all with meticulous attention, reviewing architectural drawings, approving material selections, and monitoring construction progress through regular site visits. To implement the forestry program Olmsted envisioned, George Vanderbilt hired Gifford Pinchot, a young man who had recently returned from studying forestry in Europe and who would later become the first chief of the United States Forest Service and one of the most important figures in American conservation history. Pinchot's work at Biltmore represented the first systematic attempt at scientific forest management on private land in America, and it demonstrated that forests could be managed sustainably, producing timber revenues while simultaneously protecting watersheds, preventing erosion, and maintaining ecological health. Pinchot later hired Carl Alwin Schenk, a German forester with even more extensive training in European forestry methods, to continue and expand the work at Biltmore. Schenk established the Biltmore Forest School in 1898, the first forestry school in America, training a generation of foresters who would spread scientific management principles throughout the nation and help establish the professional foundations of American conservation. In this sense, Biltmore represented something more than aristocratic pretension or conspicuous consumption, though it certainly represented both of those things as well. It was also a laboratory for ideas about land management and conservation that would have lasting impacts on American environmental policy and practice, demonstrating that private wealth, when directed by genuine intellectual interest and progressive thinking, could contribute to the public good in unexpected ways. Yet the deeper contradictions and darker dimensions of the Biltmore project could not be escaped or wished away by good intentions regarding forestry or landscape design. The house itself, for all its beauty and architectural sophistication, represented a concentration of wealth and resources on a scale that mocked the poverty and hardship experienced by millions of Americans during the same period. The cost of constructing Biltmore has never been precisely determined, as George Vanderbilt did not publish detailed accounts, and many costs were absorbed into broader estate expenses, but historians estimate that the total expenditure exceeded $6 million in the 1890s currency, equivalent to perhaps $200 million or more in contemporary terms. This staggering sum could have built thousands of decent homes for working families, funded schools and hospitals, or supported any number of social welfare programs, but instead it created a private palace for one man and his guests. The workers who built Biltmore, while presumably paid better than they might have been for other available work in rural North Carolina, nonetheless laboured in conditions that were often dangerous, and several died in construction accidents, their names largely forgotten while George Vanderbilt's name would be forever associated with the magnificent structure they created. The estate's operations, once construction was completed, required a permanent staff of hundreds of servants, gardeners, foresters, and other workers, creating a hierarchical society in miniature where the Vanderbilts and their wealthy guests existed in luxury, while those who served them lived in considerably more modest circumstances, their lives organised entirely around the needs and desires of their employers. On Christmas Eve 1895, George Vanderbilt officially opened Biltmore House, though construction on various portions of the estate would continue for several more years. The opening was not a grand public affair, but rather an intimate Christmas celebration with family members, a characteristically modest gesture from a man who, despite his enormous wealth, preferred privacy and intellectual pursuits to social display. George's mother, Maria Louisa Vanderbilt, was among the first guests, and one can only imagine her thoughts as she moved through the completed rooms of this extraordinary house, rooms that exceeded in scale and opulence even the magnificent Fifth Avenue mansion where she had raised her children. The house that greeted those first visitors represented the culmination of 6 years of almost obsessive attention to detail, and every element had been carefully considered to create an environment of refined beauty and comfort. The entrance hall, measuring 90 feet in length with a vaulted ceiling, rising 70 feet above, featured massive limestone arches, elaborate carved stone details, and a huge painting by Carl Bitter depicting the return from the chase, setting a tone of aristocratic leisure that would pervade the entire house. From this dramatic entrance, visitors could glimpse through a series of doorways the winter garden, a glass-enclosed conservatory filled with palms and tropical plants, creating an illusion of perpetual summer even in the depths of an Appalachian winter. The daily life at Biltmore during its golden years, roughly from 1895 until the beginning of World War I, represented a kind of living theatre of aristocratic existence, a carefully choreographed performance of leisure and refinement that had few parallels in American society. George Vanderbilt, now in his early 30s, had finally achieved the vision he had nursed for nearly a decade, and he threw himself into the role of Lord of the Manor with genuine enthusiasm tempered by his scholarly disposition. His days followed rhythms that would have been familiar to European nobility, mornings spent in the library reading or in his private study attending to correspondence and estate business, afternoons devoted to riding through the estate on horseback to inspect forestry operations or agricultural experiments, evenings given over to elaborate dinners followed by music, conversation, or reading in the library. George had married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in Paris in 1898, and Edith brought to Biltmore a warmth and social grace that complemented George's more reserved intellectual temperament. Edith was not from the highest tier of New York society, and her family's fortune, while substantial, could not compare to the Vanderbilt wealth, but she possessed intelligence, charm, and genuine interest in the cultural and social life of the estate that made her an ideal partner for George's ambitions. Together they entertained a carefully curated circle of guests, fellow members of elite society, artists and writers whose work George admired, scientists and scholars working on projects related to forestry or agriculture, and occasionally even local dignitaries from Asheville and the surrounding region. The house parties at Biltmore during this period were legendary among those privileged enough to receive invitations, though George and Edith were notably more selective and intellectually focused in their entertaining than many of their Vanderbilt relatives, who often hosted massive balls and entertainments designed primarily for social display. A typical house party at Biltmore might last several days or even weeks, with guests occupying the 35 bedrooms, each elaborately furnished and many featuring private bathrooms, an extraordinary luxury in an era when even wealthy homes often had limited bathing facilities. Guests would rise late, breakfast in their rooms or in the breakfast room, then spend the day in various pursuits. The men might go hunting or fishing in the extensive estate lands, or ride horses through the managed forests, while the women might stroll through the gardens, play tennis on the courts Olmsted had incorporated into the landscape design, or swim in the indoor pool located in the basement, a space finished with dramatic tilework and featuring advanced water heating and filtration systems. Evenings would begin with elaborate dinners in the banquet hall, where 20 or more courses might be served over several hours, each course accompanied by different wines from George's extensive cellars, and followed by liqueurs and cigars in the billiard room for the men while the women retired to one of the numerous sitting rooms. After dinner, the entire party might gather in the music room to hear performances on the grand piano or organ, or move to the library where George might share books from his collection, or engage guests in discussions of literature, history, or current affairs. Yet beneath this surface of gracious living and cultural refinement, Biltmore operated as an extraordinarily complex economic and social enterprise that required the constant labour of hundreds of people whose lives were organised entirely around serving the needs and desires of the Vanderbilt family and their guests. The permanent staff at Biltmore during its early decades numbered between 300 and 400 people, creating a hierarchical society in miniature that replicated and in some ways exaggerated the class divisions of the broader American society. At the top of this hierarchy were the senior household servants, the butler, who managed the male household staff and oversaw formal dining service, the housekeeper, who supervised the female staff and managed the day-to-day operations of the house, the head gardener, who directed the work of dozens of gardeners maintaining the formal gardens and grounds immediately surrounding the house, and the estate manager, who coordinated the activities of the numerous departments involved in running the larger estate operations including forestry, agriculture, and maintenance. Below these senior positions were dozens of specialised servants, footmen who served at table and attended to various household duties, ladies' maids and valets who attended to the personal needs of family members and important guests, chambermaids who cleaned the dozens of bedrooms and sitting rooms, kitchen staff including multiple cooks and numerous assistants who prepared the elaborate meals, laundresses who handled the enormous volume of linens and clothing, and maintenance workers who kept the complex mechanical systems functioning properly. Each of these positions had its own strict protocols, uniforms, and behavioural expectations, creating a rigidly stratified world where everyone knew their place, and deviation from established routines could result in immediate dismissal. The lives of Biltmore's servants were in many ways better than those of industrial workers in the cities or agricultural labourers in the rural south, but they were nonetheless circumscribed by the demands of their positions and the vast gap in power and privilege that separated them from their employers. Servants worked long hours, typically beginning before dawn and continuing until late evening, with only one day off per week and limited vacation time. They lived in servants' quarters located in less desirable parts of the house, typically small rooms with minimal furnishings and none of the luxuries enjoyed by the family and their guests. Strict rules governed their behaviour. They were expected to be invisible as much as possible, moving through the house silently and disappearing quickly when family members or guests appeared. They were forbidden from making eye contact with their employers or speaking unless spoken to. They could not use the main staircases or move through certain parts of the house, except in the performance of specific duties. Female servants faced particular vulnerabilities, as they were subject to sexual harassment or assault by male family members, guests, or senior staff, and had almost no recourse or protection, as complaining would typically result in their dismissal and ruination of their reputations. Yet for many working-class people in the region, employment at Biltmore represented a degree of economic security and social status that was otherwise difficult to obtain, and positions at the estate were often passed down through families, creating multi-generational connections to the property that would persist for decades. Beyond the immediate household staff, hundreds of additional workers were employed in the broader estate operations that made Biltmore function as an economic unit. The forestry operations, which had begun under Gifford Pinchot and continued under Carl Schenk, employed dozens of workers who were engaged in the continuous process of cutting timber, hauling logs, planting seedlings, and maintaining roads and trails through the vast forested portions of the estate. The Biltmore Forest School, which Schenk established in 1898, brought students from across America and even from Europe to learn scientific forestry methods, and these students lived in camps in the forest, working alongside regular employees and gaining practical experience in forest management. The agricultural operations of the estate included a large dairy herd that supplied milk, butter and cheese not only for the house, but also for sale to the local market, extensive vegetable gardens and orchards that provided fresh produce year-round, hog and poultry operations, and various experimental agricultural projects, reflecting George's interest in scientific farming methods. A complete village had been built to house estate workers and provide necessary services, including cottages for married employees and their families, dormitories for single workers, a school for workers' children, a hospital with a resident physician, a church, and various shops and service facilities. This estate village represented a kind of enlightened paternalism that was relatively progressive by the standards of the era, providing workers with living conditions and services superior to what they could have obtained independently. But it also created a system of dependency where workers' entire lives, including their housing, healthcare, education, and religious life, were controlled by their employer. The economic impact of Biltmore on the surrounding region was substantial and complex, creating both opportunities and distortions in the local economy. The construction phase had brought an influx of workers and money into the Asheville area, stimulating growth in the town and surrounding communities, and the ongoing operations of the estate continued to provide employment for hundreds of people, making Biltmore one of the largest employers in western North Carolina. The estate's purchases of supplies and services from local merchants and craftsmen injected considerable money into the regional economy, and George's interest in improving local infrastructure, including his support for better roads, and his involvement in establishing the Biltmore Industries, which trained and employed local craftspeople in woodworking and textile production, brought some broader economic benefits to the community. Yet the estate also represented a massive concentration of land and resources that was removed from normal market operations and productive use, and its existence created economic dependencies and power imbalances that shaped the development of the region in ways that were not always beneficial to local residents. Small farmers and landowners who sold their property to George Vanderbilt often did so because they were struggling economically, and while they received fair market prices by the standards of the time, the gradual accumulation of such vast land holdings by a single wealthy individual reduced opportunities for land ownership by ordinary people and reinforced patterns of economic inequality that had deep roots in Southern history. The birth of George and Edith's only child, Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, in August 1900, added a new dimension to life at Biltmore and raised questions about the estate's future that would eventually become pressing. Cornelia was born at Biltmore House and spent her childhood in this extraordinary environment, growing up in circumstances of luxury and privilege that few American children have ever experienced. Her early years were filled with nurses, governesses, and tutors who provided education and care according to the highest standards of the era, and she had the run of an estate that was essentially a private kingdom, with forests to explore, horses to ride, and servants to attend to her every need. Yet Cornelia's childhood was also marked by a certain isolation, as there were few children of her own age and social class in the region, and much of her social life consisted of interactions with adult guests at her parents' house parties, or visits to relatives in New York and other cities. George and Edith were devoted parents who took genuine interest in their daughter's education and development, and they attempted to raise her with some sense of responsibility and awareness of the broader world beyond Biltmore's gates, but the enormous wealth and privilege that surrounded her from birth inevitably shaped her perspective in profound ways. The question of what would happen to Biltmore when Cornelia eventually inherited it was never far from George's mind, and he took steps to ensure that the estate would remain intact and continue to operate according to his vision, creating trust arrangements and management structures that would outlive him, though he could not have foreseen the forces that would eventually transform both Biltmore and the broader society in which it existed. The first decade of the 20th century represented the peak years of the Gilded Age estate culture in America, with wealthy families across the country building or maintaining elaborate country houses that served as centres of social life and displays of cultural refinement and economic power. The Vanderbilt family alone maintained numerous such estates. George's brother, Frederick, had built a magnificent mansion in Hyde Park, New York, while other relatives owned properties in Newport, Rhode Island, Long Island, and various other fashionable locations. These estates formed a network of aristocratic life that operated largely independent of the broader American society, with wealthy families moving in carefully orchestrated circuits from one property to another, from city mansions in winter to country estates in spring and fall to seaside resorts in summer, always surrounded by their servants and maintaining a lifestyle that seemed to exist in a different dimension from the experience of ordinary Americans. Yet even at the height of this golden age, forces were gathering that would eventually undermine this entire social structure and force transformations that none of the participants could have anticipated. The progressive movement was gaining strength in American politics, bringing demands for regulation of monopolistic corporations, reform of corrupt political machines, conservation of natural resources, and greater attention to social welfare and economic justice. Labour unions, despite violent opposition from employers, were growing in membership and sophistication, and strikes and labour actions continued to disrupt industries and force at least limited concessions from owners. The federal government was beginning to assert greater regulatory power over the economy, most notably through the enforcement of antitrust laws against monopolistic corporations, though the Vanderbilt Railroad empire had so far largely escaped the most aggressive regulatory efforts. Even more fundamentally, the entire economic and social structure of the Gilded Age was becoming increasingly unstable and unsustainable. The vast fortunes accumulated during the late 19th century had been built on particular historical circumstances that were already changing. The availability of seemingly endless natural resources to exploit, a surplus of cheap labour provided by mass immigration, minimal government regulation of business practices, and a political system that was heavily influenced, if not outright controlled, by corporate interests. All of these conditions were being challenged by progressive reformers, labour organisers, and emerging social movements that demanded a more equitable distribution of wealth and power. And while the wealthy elites resisted these challenges with all the resources at their command, they were fighting against historical forces larger than any individual or class could ultimately control. The very conspicuousness of estates like Biltmore, their visible demonstration of extreme wealth and privilege, made them targets for criticism and symbols of economic inequality that reformers could point to when arguing for systemic change. George Vanderbilt, to his credit, was aware of some of these tensions and attempted to operate Biltmore in ways that were at least somewhat responsive to progressive ideals, particularly through his support for scientific forestry and conservation, his efforts to provide decent living conditions for estate workers, and his generally modest personal demeanour that avoided the most ostentatious displays of wealth that characterised some members of his family. Yet no amount of personal moderation or enlightened paternalism could resolve the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Biltmore. It was a monument to aristocratic privilege built in a democratic republic, a private kingdom carved out of American soil, a concentration of wealth and resources on a scale that mocked the egalitarian ideals that were at least nominally central to American identity. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 marked the beginning of the end for the Gilded Age estate culture, though the full implications would only become clear over the following decades. The war devastated Europe and destroyed the aristocratic social order that had been the model for American estates like Biltmore, killing millions and bankrupting governments and leaving in its wake political revolutions and social upheavals that would reshape the 20th century. In America, the war years brought new federal taxes on income and estates that would make it increasingly difficult for wealthy families to maintain their lavish lifestyles and pass their fortunes intact to future generations. And they also accelerated social and economic changes that had been underway before the war, but which now proceeded with revolutionary speed. Women gained the right to vote in 1920, marking a fundamental shift in political power and social relations. The massive mobilization required by the war demonstrated the capacity of the federal government to organize and direct the national economy in ways that had previously been unimaginable, setting precedents that would be invoked in future decades when dealing with economic crises and social problems. African Americans who had migrated north to work in war industries or who had served in the military returned with new expectations and demands for civil rights and economic opportunities, beginning a long struggle that would eventually transform American race relations. The entire social order that had sustained estates like Biltmore was beginning to crack, and while the full collapse was still years away, the foundations were eroding in ways that could not be stopped or reversed. George Vanderbilt died suddenly in March 1914, at the age of 51, following surgery for complications from appendicitis. His death was a shock to his family and to everyone associated with Biltmore, and it raised immediate questions about the future of the estate he had spent 26 years creating and perfecting. George's death occurred in Washington, D.C., where he had been staying, and his body was returned to Biltmore for burial in a private ceremony, attended by family members and close associates. He was interred on the estate grounds, in a small cemetery that had been established for family burials, and his grave overlooks the vast forests and mountains that he had devoted so much of his life to preserving and managing. George left behind a widow, Edith, who was only 41 years old, and a daughter, Cornelia, who was just 13. He also left behind an estate that was magnificent, but also extraordinarily expensive to maintain, generating nowhere near enough revenue from its forestry and agricultural operations to cover its ongoing costs, and which would face increasing financial pressures in the years ahead as taxes rose and the economic conditions that had sustained Gilded Age fortunes continued to erode. The story of Biltmore after George's death would be the story of Edith Vanderbilt's determined efforts to preserve her husband's legacy while adapting to radically changed circumstances, and eventually the story of how an aristocratic private estate was transformed into something quite different, a transformation that reflected broader changes in American society and values. The years following George Vanderbilt's death in 1914 brought challenges to Biltmore Estate that would have seemed almost unimaginable during the golden years of lavish house parties and aristocratic leisure that had defined the property's first 2 decades. Edith Vanderbilt found herself suddenly responsible for managing an estate of staggering complexity and expense, with hundreds of employees depending on her decisions, vast land holdings requiring constant management, and a house so large that simply maintaining it consumed enormous resources even without considering the broader estate operations. Edith was intelligent, capable, and deeply devoted to preserving her late husband's legacy, but she faced obstacles that would have daunted anyone, and which were compounded by the fact that she was a woman operating in a world where business and financial management were almost exclusively male domains. The outbreak of World War I, just months after George's death, created additional complications, disrupting international markets, making imported luxury goods difficult to obtain, and creating a social climate in which ostentatious displays of wealth seemed increasingly inappropriate as young men from across America, including from the mountains of western North Carolina, went off to fight and die in European trenches. Edith made the difficult decision to close much of the house and reduce the household staff, maintaining only the essential rooms and services necessary for herself and Cornelia to live relatively comfortably, while dramatically cutting expenses that had become unsustainable given the estate's limited revenue-generating capacity. The financial realities of Biltmore had always been problematic, though during George's lifetime his personal fortune had been sufficient to cover the substantial annual deficits the estate generated. George had inherited approximately $10 million from his father's estate, a vast fortune by any ordinary standard, but actually one of the smaller shares among the Vanderbilt children, and he had spent a significant portion of this inheritance on acquiring land and constructing the house and its supporting infrastructure. The estate's forestry operations, while scientifically sophisticated and important for conservation purposes, generated only modest revenues that were largely offset by the costs of maintaining the forest management programs and paying workers. The agricultural operations similarly produced some income from sales of dairy products, produce, and other farm goods, but these revenues were dwarfed by the costs of maintaining the facilities, animals, and workforce required for operations at this scale. The house itself generated no revenue at all, but consumed enormous sums for heating, lighting, repairs, and the wages of the household staff required to maintain and operate it. During George's lifetime, these ongoing deficits had been covered by income from his investments in railroad securities and other financial assets inherited from his father, but the estate taxes imposed after his death, combined with wartime disruptions to financial markets and the ongoing operating expenses, placed severe strain on the resources available to Edith. She was forced to make decisions that George had never needed to contemplate: which parts of the estate operations could be scaled back or eliminated, which staff positions were truly essential and which could be cut, how to generate additional revenue to offset the relentless consumption of capital that maintaining Biltmore required. One of Edith's most significant and difficult decisions came in 1916 when she sold approximately 87,000 acres of Biltmore's forest lands to the federal government for $5 per acre, a transaction that created the core of what would become Pisgah National Forest, one of the first national forests in the eastern United States. This sale was partly motivated by financial necessity, as the land generated expenses but relatively little revenue, and the funds from the sale provided capital that could be used to maintain the house and core estate operations. But the decision also reflected Edith's genuine commitment to conservation principles that George had championed, and her recognition that the scientific forestry practices developed at Biltmore could have their greatest impact if the land passed into public ownership, where it could be managed for long-term sustainability and public benefit rather than private profit. The sale was bittersweet, representing both a loss of the vast domain George had assembled and a fulfillment of his deeper values regarding forest conservation and scientific land management. Gifford Pinchot, who had begun his career at Biltmore and had since become a national figure in the conservation movement, praised Edith's decision and recognized it as an important contribution to the establishment of a national forest system in the eastern United States, where virtually all land was privately owned and where public forest reserves had seemed almost impossible to establish. The transaction reduced Biltmore from its maximum extent of approximately 125,000 acres to a more manageable but still substantial estate of roughly 25,000 acres surrounding the house, and including the most intensively managed gardens, forests, and agricultural lands. The decade following World War I brought accelerating social and economic changes that further undermined the viability of aristocratic estates like Biltmore and the lifestyle they represented. The income tax, which had been enacted in 1913 but initially affected only the very wealthy and at relatively modest rates, was dramatically increased during the war and remained at elevated levels afterward, significantly reducing the after-tax income available to wealthy families for maintaining expensive properties. Estate taxes, first enacted in 1916, created a new threat to the intergenerational transfer of wealth that had sustained family fortunes and made possible the maintenance of properties like Biltmore across multiple generations. The social atmosphere was also changing in ways that made the ostentatious consumption and aristocratic pretensions of the Gilded Age seem increasingly out of step with American values and aspirations. The 1920s saw the emergence of new forms of wealth and celebrity associated with entertainment, sports, and innovative industries like automobiles and aviation, and the old aristocracy of inherited industrial fortune seemed increasingly staid and irrelevant compared to the dynamic energy of this new America. The servant class that had made possible the operation of large estates was also changing, as young people, particularly women, found new employment opportunities in offices, shops, and factories that offered better pay, more independence, and less social subordination than traditional domestic service. Finding and retaining qualified household staff became increasingly difficult for estate owners, and the traditional hierarchical relationships between employers and servants that had characterized Gilded Age households were eroding as notions of social deference declined and demands for worker rights and dignity increased. Cornelia and John Cecil initially lived at Biltmore with Edith, and John took on increasing responsibility for managing estate operations as Edith began to withdraw from active management. The Cecils had two sons, George Henry Vanderbilt Cecil, born in 1925, and William Amherst. Vanderbilt Cecil, born in 1928, ensuring another generation of family connection to the estate and raising hopes that Biltmore might continue as a family home, despite the challenging economic environment. John Cecil proved to be a capable manager who understood the necessity of finding new revenue sources to offset the estate's ongoing expenses, and he began exploring various schemes to make Biltmore more economically sustainable. The estate's dairy operations were expanded and modernized, with the goal of producing high-quality dairy products that could be sold at premium prices to discriminating customers. The forest continued to be managed for timber production, though on a reduced scale compared to George's original vision, and selective cutting provided some revenue while maintaining the landscape's aesthetic qualities. Various agricultural enterprises were tried, abandoned or modified, based on their economic performance and their fit with the estate's overall character. Yet all of these efforts generated only modest revenues compared to the enormous costs of maintaining the house and grounds, and it became increasingly clear that more dramatic changes would be necessary if Biltmore was to survive as anything more than a slowly decaying monument to a vanished era. The Great Depression, which began with the stock market crash of 1929 and deepened over the following years into the worst economic crisis in American history, brought Biltmore to the brink of catastrophic failure and forced decisions that would fundamentally transform the estate's character and purpose. The Vanderbilt family fortune, like virtually all American fortunes, suffered massive losses as stock values collapsed and businesses failed, and the income from investments that had sustained Biltmore since George's death largely evaporated. Tax revenues declined dramatically as well, forcing state and local governments to increase property tax rates even as property values fell, and Biltmore's tax burden became increasingly onerous relative to its declining revenue. The estate's workforce had to be cut repeatedly, with long-serving employees dismissed or forced to accept reduced wages, and even essential maintenance had to be deferred as cash flow became desperately tight. Parts of the house that had been closed since World War I remained shuttered, their furnishings covered with dust sheets, their systems gradually deteriorating from lack of use and maintenance. The gardens, which had required dozens of gardeners to maintain in their original glory, were simplified and reduced in scale, with elaborate plantings replaced by simpler designs requiring less intensive labour. The entire estate took on an air of genteel decay, still beautiful but no longer pristine, still functioning but no longer operating at the level of perfection that George Vanderbilt had demanded and achieved. Cornelia's response to these pressures was to effectively abandon Biltmore and the responsibilities that came with it, a decision that revealed the psychological toll of trying to maintain an aristocratic lifestyle in increasingly hostile circumstances and which had profound implications for the estate's future. By the early 1930s, Cornelia's marriage to John Cecil was deteriorating, strained by financial pressures, by the isolation of life at Biltmore, and perhaps by fundamental incompatibilities that had been masked during their courtship by the romance of international nobility and American wealth. Cornelia began spending more time away from Biltmore, travelling to New York and Europe, and her absences grew longer and more frequent. In 1934, she left John and Biltmore permanently, moving to Europe and later becoming involved in various bohemian and artistic circles that represented a complete rejection of the aristocratic world in which she'd been raised. She and John eventually divorced, and Cornelia would spend most of the rest of her life abroad, having relatively limited contact with her sons, and seemingly unable or unwilling to cope with the decline of the world of privilege and certainty that had defined her youth. Cornelia's departure left Edith, now in her 60s, once again responsible for Biltmore's management and for raising her grandsons, a burden she accepted with characteristic determination, but which must have been deeply painful, representing as it did the failure of her hopes that Cornelia would take up the stewardship of George's legacy and carry it forward to another generation. The solution that would ultimately save Biltmore from complete dissolution came from an unlikely source, and represented a fundamental transformation in the estate's purpose and meaning. In 1930, John Cecil had begun experimenting with opening parts of the estate to paying visitors, a decision driven by desperate financial necessity, but one that violated every principle of privacy and exclusivity that had defined Biltmore since its creation. The idea of turning a private home into a tourist attraction would have been almost unthinkable to George Vanderbilt, who had built Biltmore precisely to create a refuge from public scrutiny and a private world where he and his guests could pursue refined living free from the intrusions of the outside world. Yet by 1930, the alternative to some form of public access was likely the complete liquidation of the estate, the sale of its lands and furnishings, and the possible abandonment or demolition of the house itself, a fate that had already befallen numerous Gilded Age mansions whose owners could no longer afford to maintain them. The initial public opening was modest and carefully controlled, with only certain parts of the house and grounds accessible and with visiting hours strictly limited, but it proved surprisingly successful, attracting curious tourists eager to glimpse how the very wealthy had lived, and generating revenue that, while insufficient to solve all of Biltmore's financial problems, at least provided some relief from the relentless pressure of expenses exceeding income. The transition from private estate to tourist destination accelerated during and after World War II, driven by continued financial pressures and by recognition that tourism offered the only realistic path to Biltmore's long-term survival. During the war years, Biltmore played an unexpected role in art conservation when the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. sought a secure location to store its most valuable paintings in case of enemy attack on the capital. The gallery's curators selected Biltmore for this purpose, and for several years masterpieces by artists including Rembrandt, Van Dyck and Gilbert Stuart were stored in the estate's music room, protected by Biltmore's solid construction, its relative remoteness from strategic targets, and its climate control systems that, though aging, still functioned well enough to preserve delicate artworks. This wartime service brought Biltmore positive publicity and reinforced its identity as a cultural institution rather than merely a private residence, helping to legitimize its transition toward greater public access. After the war, as America entered a period of unprecedented prosperity, and as automobile ownership became nearly universal, tourism emerged as a major industry, and destinations like Biltmore that could offer unique experiences and glimpses into American history found growing audiences eager to visit and willing to pay admission fees. Edith Vanderbilt died in 1958 at the age of 86, having devoted 4 decades to preserving Biltmore and adapting it to radically changed circumstances that her husband could never have anticipated. Her death marked the end of the generation that had created and first lived at Biltmore, and it transferred full control of the estate to her grandsons, George and William Cecil, who were now in their 30s and who faced the challenge of determining what Biltmore should become in the second half of the 20th century. The brothers initially managed the estate together, but they had different visions for its future and different management styles, tensions that eventually led to a division of responsibilities, with William taking primary control of the house and tourism operations, while George focused on the estate's agricultural and land management activities. Under William Cecil's leadership in particular, Biltmore was systematically transformed from a struggling private estate operating a modest tourism sideline into a professional tourist attraction and heritage site that would attract millions of visitors and generate substantial revenues while preserving the house and its collections for future generations. This transformation required massive investments in infrastructure, including parking facilities, visitor centres, restaurants, and gift shops, all carefully designed to accommodate large numbers of tourists, while minimising visual impact on the historic house and landscape. It required development of professional interpretation and education programs to help visitors understand and appreciate what they were seeing. It required ongoing restoration and conservation work to repair decades of deferred maintenance and to preserve furnishings, artworks, and architectural elements that were deteriorating from age and environmental exposure. The transformation also required difficult decisions about authenticity and commercialization, about how much to modify the estate to accommodate tourists and generate revenue, while preserving its historical integrity and the vision George Vanderbilt had articulated in creating it. Some changes were relatively uncontroversial, installing modern fire suppression and security systems, creating accessible pathways for visitors with disabilities, establishing retail operations selling books and merchandise related to the estate's history. Other changes were more problematic, adding a winery that had no historical connection to George's era, but which capitalized on the growing American interest in wine and provided a profitable revenue stream, developing an inn and additional lodging facilities on estate grounds, hosting weddings, corporate events, and other private functions that generated substantial fees, but which reduced public access and arguably commercialized spaces that had been designed for family use. The Cecil family has consistently maintained that all changes have been made thoughtfully and with respect for George Vanderbilt's original vision, and that the alternative to such commercial adaptations would have been the estate's dissolution and the likely loss of the house and its collections. Critics have sometimes argued that Biltmore has been over-commercialized, that it has become more theme park than historic site, and that the proliferation of gift shops, restaurants, and commercial ventures has compromised its historical integrity. These debates reflect broader tensions in heritage preservation about how to balance financial sustainability with historical authenticity, questions that have no easy answers and which must be continually renegotiated as circumstances change. By the dawn of the 21st century, Biltmore Estate had achieved a form of stability and success that would have seemed impossible during the desperate years of the Great Depression, yet this success had come at the cost of a fundamental transformation in the estate's nature and purpose. What George Vanderbilt had created as the ultimate private retreat, a self-contained world where wealth and culture could exist in harmonious isolation from the industrial chaos of Gilded Age America, had become one of the most visited historic house museums in the United States, attracting over 1 million paying visitors annually and generating revenues exceeding $100 million per year from admissions, retail operations, hospitality services, and related enterprises. The house itself, meticulously maintained and continuously restored, using modern conservation techniques that George could never have imagined, looks in many ways more pristine now than it did during much of the 20th century. Its limestone façade cleaned and repaired, its systems updated with climate control equipment that preserves furnishings and artworks while remaining largely invisible to visitors, its rooms arranged to suggest the life of a Gilded Age family, while actually functioning as carefully curated museum exhibits. The gardens, though simplified from Olmsted's original elaborate designs, are maintained at a high standard by a professional horticultural staff, and they provide visitors with beautiful landscapes that change with the seasons and offer glimpses of the aesthetic principles that guided the estate's original creation. The broader estate lands, reduced from George's maximum of 125,000 acres to approximately 8,000 acres that remain under Cecil family control, continue to be managed for forestry, agriculture, and conservation purposes, though always with an eye toward their contribution to the overall visitor experience and their economic productivity. The financial model that sustains modern Biltmore is complex and sophisticated, relying on multiple revenue streams that work together to generate the substantial annual income required to maintain the property and support the nearly 2,000 employees who work in various capacities across the estate's operations. Admission fees, which have risen steadily over the decades and now cost approximately $75 per adult for a basic daytime ticket, represent the foundation of the revenue model, and careful management of visitor flows, pricing strategies, and seasonal programming works to maximize admission revenues while controlling costs and preventing overcrowding that might degrade the visitor experience. The estate has developed numerous supplementary offerings that generate additional revenue beyond basic admission. Behind-the-scenes tours providing access to normally closed areas, special holiday programs and seasonal events that encourage repeat visitation, audio guide rentals that enhance the interpretive experience. Photography permits for visitors who wish to use the estate as a backdrop for professional photo sessions. The winery operation, established in the 1980s and expanded repeatedly since then, has become a major profit centre, producing and selling wines under the Biltmore label, and operating tasting rooms and retail spaces that capitalise on the estate's prestige and the growing sophistication of American wine consumers. the hospitality operations, including the inn on Biltmore estate, a luxury hotel that opened in 2001, and various restaurants and food service venues scattered across the property, generate substantial revenues while providing visitors with options to extend their stays and deepen their engagement with the estate. Retail operations, selling everything from books about the estate's history to reproduction furnishings and decorative items to branded merchandise, contribute significant revenues with relatively high profit margins. This commercial success has enabled extraordinary investments in preservation and restoration that have saved Biltmore from the decay and eventual loss that has befallen so many Gilded Age estates, yet it has also raised persistent questions about authenticity, appropriateness, and the line between preservation and exploitation. The house that visitors see today is in many ways more complete and better preserved than it was during much of its existence as a private home, with furnishings professionally conserved, surfaces cleaned and repaired, systems functioning reliably, and interpretation provided by trained staff who can explain the historical context and significance of what visitors are seeing. Yet it is also fundamentally different from the lived-in home that George and Edith knew, the house where their daughter grew up, and where generations of servants worked, and where the daily rhythms of aristocratic life unfolded according to patterns that are now almost completely vanished from American experience. The modern Biltmore is a performance of history, a carefully constructed representation of the past that serves contemporary needs and values, and while the Cecil family and the estate's professional staff have worked hard to ensure that this performance is grounded in solid historical research and respects the material integrity of the historic fabric, it is nonetheless a performance shaped by decisions about what to show and what to hide, what stories to tell and what stories to leave untold, what aspects of the past to celebrate and what aspects to critique or contextualize. The interpretation that Biltmore provides to its visitors has evolved considerably over the decades, reflecting changing historical scholarship, shifting public attitudes toward wealth and inequality, and growing recognition that the stories of great houses must include not only the families who owned them, but also the workers who made them function, and the broader social contexts in which they existed. Early interpretive efforts, beginning when the house first opened to tourists in the 1930s and continuing through much of the 20th century, focused almost exclusively on the Vanderbilt family, the house's architecture and collections, and the aesthetic and cultural achievements that Biltmore represented. Visitors were invited to admire the beautiful rooms, the priceless artworks, the architectural sophistication, and the refined taste of George Vanderbilt, with relatively little attention paid to how the wealth that made all this possible was created, what the lives of the estate's workers were like, or how Biltmore fit into broader patterns of social and economic inequality in Gilded Age and early 20th century America. More recent interpretive programming has attempted to provide more balanced and comprehensive perspectives, including exhibits and tours that explore the lives of servants and estate workers, that discuss the sources of Vanderbilt wealth and the labour and industrial systems that generated it, and that place Biltmore within the context of Gilded Age excess and progressive era reform movements that sought to address the social problems created by extreme inequality. These newer interpretive approaches represent genuine attempts to provide visitors with more historically accurate and ethically responsible understandings of the estate and its meaning. Yet they also face inherent limitations, as Biltmore remains a commercial enterprise that depends on attracting visitors who generally come seeking beautiful spaces and romantic narratives, rather than critical examinations of class structure and economic exploitation. The question of how to interpret and present difficult or troubling aspects of history is not unique to Biltmore, but reflects broader challenges facing historic sites, museums, and heritage institutions across America and around the world. How do we honour and preserve remarkable achievements in architecture, design, and craftsmanship, while also acknowledging that these achievements were made possible by systems of exploitation and inequality? How do we tell the stories of wealthy and powerful people whose lives are relatively well documented, while also recovering and honouring the stories of workers and servants, whose lives left fewer traces in the historical record? How do we help contemporary visitors understand and appreciate aspects of the past that differ dramatically from current values and practices without either romanticizing problematic elements or imposing anachronistic moral judgments that distort historical understanding? These questions have no simple answers, and different institutions approach them in different ways based on their particular circumstances, missions, and constituencies. Biltmore's approach has generally been to expand and complicate its narratives over time, adding new interpretive layers while maintaining the core focus on the house's beauty and the Vanderbilt family's story that continues to be what most visitors primarily seek. This approach has strengths, allowing the estate to reach broad audiences and generate the revenues necessary for preservation, while gradually introducing more critical and contextualized perspectives. But it also has limitations, as the fundamentally commercial nature of the enterprise inevitably constrains how far critical examination can proceed without alienating visitors or undermining the romantic appeal that draws people to the site in the first place. Beyond the specific challenges of interpretation and preservation, Biltmore's story raises profound questions about wealth, power, and legacy in American society that remain urgently relevant more than a century after George Vanderbilt first conceived his mountain estate. The Gilded Age, which provided the context for Biltmore's creation, bears uncomfortable similarities to our own time, with extreme concentrations of wealth in the hands of a small number of individuals and families, growing inequality between rich and poor, heated debates about the proper role of government in regulating the economy and providing for social welfare, and fundamental questions about whether democratic institutions can function effectively when economic power is so unevenly distributed. The great fortunes of our own era, built on technology, finance, and global trade rather than railroads and industry, exceed even in inflation-adjusted terms the fortunes of the Vanderbilts and their contemporaries, and the lifestyle differences between wealthy elites and ordinary citizens are at least as dramatic now as they were in 1895. The contemporary equivalents of Biltmore exist in the form of massive estates, private islands, super yachts, and other displays of extreme wealth that serve many of the same functions that George Vanderbilt's mansion served, demonstrating status, providing privacy and security, creating self-contained worlds where the wealthy can live according to their own preferences, insulated from the problems and concerns of the broader society. Yet we might also note important differences. The wealthy of our own era are generally more mobile and less rooted in particular places than the Gilded Age aristocracy. Their wealth is more likely to be liquid and global, rather than tied to specific industrial enterprises or landed estates, and the tax and regulatory environment, while more favourable to wealth accumulation now than it was in the mid-20th century, still imposes constraints on dynastic wealth preservation that did not exist in George Vanderbilt's time. The question of what Biltmore ultimately represents and what lessons we should draw from its history admits no single answer, but rather opens onto a complex terrain of competing interpretations and values. From one perspective, Biltmore stands as a testament to human creativity, ambition, and the capacity of wealth to sponsor beauty and excellence when directed by refined taste and genuine cultural values. George Vanderbilt, whatever his privilege and whatever the problematic sources of his fortune, created something of lasting beauty and cultural significance, and his vision for the estate included progressive elements, particularly regarding forestry and conservation, that had genuine beneficial impacts extending far beyond his private domain. The house itself is an extraordinary architectural achievement, combining historical references with innovative building techniques and systems, and its preservation provides contemporary audiences with valuable insights into Gilded Age material culture, aesthetic sensibilities, and ways of life that have otherwise largely vanished. The estate's ongoing operations, employing nearly 2,000 people and contributing substantially to the regional economy of Western North Carolina, represent a form of legacy that continues to generate benefits for contemporary society, and the professional standards of preservation and interpretation that Biltmore maintains set positive examples for other heritage institutions facing similar challenges of sustainability and relevance. Yet from another equally valid perspective, Biltmore represents everything problematic about extreme wealth concentration and the social structures that enable and perpetuate inequality across generations. The enormous resources consumed in building and maintaining this single private home, resources that could have been directed toward addressing pressing social needs or distributed more equitably among the workers whose labour created the Vanderbilt fortune, exemplify the moral failures of a society that permitted such extreme disparities in wealth and power. The aristocratic pretensions embedded in Biltmore's design and original purpose, the conscious attempt to recreate European feudal relationships in a supposedly democratic republic, reveal the fundamentally anti-democratic impulses of Gilded Age elites and their contempt for egalitarian values. The transformation of the estate into a tourist attraction, while practically necessary for its preservation, represents a form of commodification of history that reduces complex social realities to entertainment and that sanitizes or obscures the exploitation and inequality that made estates like Biltmore possible. The continuing ownership and control of the property by George Vanderbilt's descendants, who have derived enormous financial benefits from the estate's commercial operations, perpetuates dynastic privilege and demonstrates how wealth, once accumulated, can reproduce itself across generations even as the specific forms and sources of that wealth change dramatically. Perhaps the most honest assessment of Biltmore must hold both of these perspectives in tension, recognizing that the estate embodies genuine achievements and values worthy of preservation and appreciation, while simultaneously acknowledging the deeply problematic context in which it was created and the troubling questions it raises about the relationship between wealth and democracy, private property and public good, individual ambition and social responsibility. George Vanderbilt's vision, for all its cultural sophistication and aesthetic refinement, was ultimately a fantasy of escape from the modern world and its problems, an attempt to create a private utopia insulated from the industrial capitalism and social conflict that had generated his family's wealth. That this fantasy could be realized, that one individual could command sufficient resources to acquire 125,000 acres, construct a house of 250 rooms, employ hundreds of workers, and create a self-contained domain operating according to his personal preferences, reveals something fundamental about the power that extreme wealth confers and the ways in which that power can distort social relationships and subvert democratic norms. Yet we might also recognize that George Vanderbilt, unlike many of his contemporaries, at least attempted to use his wealth in ways that reflected some sense of responsibility and cultural purpose, that he took seriously the stewardship of the land under his control, that he supported important innovations in forestry and conservation, and that he created something of lasting beauty that continues to provide pleasure and education to millions of people more than a century after his death. The story of Biltmore, traced from George Vanderbilt's initial vision through the golden years of aristocratic entertaining, through the difficult decades of financial struggle and adaptation, to its current incarnation as a successful heritage tourism destination, ultimately illustrates both the power of human ambition and creativity and the limits that history and social forces impose on even the most privileged individuals. George Vanderbilt built his mountain retreat to create a timeless world of beauty and refinement, but history would not cooperate with this vision of permanence. The social and economic order that made Biltmore possible eroded and eventually collapsed, forcing adaptations that George could never have imagined and that would likely have horrified him. The private estate became a public attraction, the exclusive retreat became a commercial enterprise, the lived-in home became a museum performing history for paying audiences. Yet something of George's original vision persists, preserved not in the form he intended, but in a transformed state that responds to contemporary needs and values while maintaining threads of connection to the past. The house still stands, its rooms still beautiful, its gardens still offering respite and pleasure, its forests still demonstrating principles of sustainable management that George and his foresters pioneered. The estate continues to function as a cultural institution, though now serving the many rather than the privileged few, and it continues to employ hundreds of people and contribute to its regional economy, though now through tourism and hospitality rather than forestry and agriculture. What then should we take away from Biltmore's complex and often troubling history? Perhaps first a recognition that the past is never simply good or bad, never merely something to celebrate or to condemn, but rather a complicated reality that must be understood in its full context and complexity. Biltmore embodies both remarkable achievements and serious moral failures, and we diminish our understanding by reducing it to either celebratory narrative or simple critique. Second, we might recognize that preservation is always transformation, that keeping the past alive in the present necessarily means changing it, adapting it to new purposes and new audiences, making choices about what to emphasize and what to downplay, what to show and what to hide. The Biltmore that exists today is not the Biltmore that George Vanderbilt created, and this is not a failure, but rather an acknowledgement of the reality that the past exists for us now only as we remake it in forms that speak to our contemporary concerns and questions. Third, we might acknowledge that questions of wealth, power, and inequality that were so central to the Gilded Age remain urgent in our own time, and that examining estates like Biltmore can help us think more clearly about these persistent challenges, and about the choices we face regarding how to structure our economy and society, how to balance private property rights with public needs, how to ensure that wealth serves human flourishing rather than merely accumulating in the hands of the fortunate few. The dark story of America's largest mansion is ultimately not a story of haunting or scandal in the conventional sense, though there are elements of tragedy in Cornelia's abandonment of her heritage and elements of loss in the gradual erosion of the Vanderbilt fortune and the world it sustained. The darkness lies rather in what Biltmore reveals about the society that produced it, a society capable of extraordinary creativity and achievement, but also characterized by brutal exploitation and staggering inequality, a society that proclaimed democratic values while permitting concentrations of wealth and power that mocked those values, a society that created beauty and culture for the few while neglecting the basic needs and dignity of the many. That George Vanderbilt was in many ways a thoughtful and cultivated person, that he used his wealth with more restraint and purpose than many of his contemporaries, that he created something of lasting value that continues to provide employment and pleasure more than a century after his death, does not erase these darker realities, but rather makes them more complicated and more challenging to our understanding. Biltmore stands as both monument and warning, a monument to what human ambition and resources can achieve when directed by refined taste and cultural vision, and a warning about the social costs of extreme inequality and the fragility of worlds built on foundations of concentrated wealth and privilege. In preserving Biltmore and opening it to public view, we keep alive not only beautiful rooms and carefully tended gardens, but also crucial questions about the kind of society we want to be and the values we want to embody. Questions that each generation must answer anew in its own context and according to its own lights.